Thank you, Chairman. I just want to take my time to join our ranking member in expressing my concern that the Republican majority is tearing down a longstanding and I think valuable tradition of the Senate and of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the blue slip. This is a particularly egregious case of it because in one case, the bipartisan senators had a bipartisan home state process for considering nominees. And as we, I hope, try to work towards bipartisanship in some respects, when you have a Republican senator and a Democratic senator from the home state, and rather than have battles over this, they have reached an agreement to have a bipartisan process and let that bipartisan process work its will and produce a recommendation whom they can both support, to then not only take down the blue slip process here in the Senate, but also to explode those bipartisan home state processes, not just in the states that are affected today, but by all other states, because now they can see it coming. They know that that is no longer a worthwhile enterprise because the Judiciary Committee will blow up the product of its work just to suit the purposes of whichever senator happens to be in the majority party. Okay, right now the Republicans are in the majority party, but things change, and I think we really ought to think long and hard about whether this is the place the Senate wants to go. Because once you tear down a tradition like this, it's really hard to rebuild it. And I don't think it comes back after this. And this is up to you guys. We don't control this. If you don't want to honor, Mr. Chairman, the blue slip any longer, that's your call. Nobody else has responsibility or accountability for that. That's entirely your call to make. And there's nothing that we can do about it. But I want to register that I think it's a very bad move for the Senate. It's a very bad move for bipartisanship. And it continues to raise the question of what's the big deal that makes everybody so desperate to jam judges through that in this case, they're even willing to destroy, in the case of today's hearing, we're even willing to destroy the blue slip process and tear that down in order to get there. And what I see out of, as a general proposition, Republican nominees is a desire in cases that relate to firearm safety to always rule with the gun industry, in cases that relate to access to the ballot to always vote for limiting access to the ballot, in cases that involve polluters to always vote for deregulation, and in cases that involve women's issues to always vote for the most traditional view of those issues, to put it mildly. And when it's hard for me to find a logical theory or principle that connects all of those issues. The common analytical thread that makes you for the firearms industry, for the polluters, against women's rights, and so forth. I just don't see the common analytical thread. The common connection is that the interests at stake there are all very big Republican partisan interests. And so, you know, maybe that is the motivation for tearing down now, what, nearly 100 years old?
Yeah.
Senator Feinstein? 100 years old Senate traditions. And, you know, you get to do that. You get to do that, Mr. Chairman, but it's going to be very hard to rebuild it. And I think it's just a very, very, very unfortunate circumstance that we find ourselves in with respect to the Senate, and it's a very unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in with respect to the politicization of the judiciary and the desire of big special interests to control outcomes in cases where their industry will face these nominees in the future. I just don't think it's right, and I wanted to take my time to say so because I think we're at a terribly important precipice right now, right here in this committee today. Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Klein, welcome. It's good to see you here. Although I must say your agency has the worst acronym I've ever heard. PCLOB, really? You wrote in July of 2017 that the scale of the potential privacy concern regarding 702 appears small. In 2016, only one FBI search for information about an American in a non-national security criminal investigation led the FBI to review messages collected under 702. Could you elaborate on that?
Thank you, Senator. I believe that was referring to a specific practice of querying information collected under Section 702 for U.S. person identifiers, and specifically by one agency, the FBI. That said, as I've written in the past, that is a very important issue that does raise significant privacy concerns. And so in the bipartisan report that two colleagues and I put out in December 2016, we had a number of recommendations, nearly 10 recommendations, to address privacy concerns raised by that practice. I also presented a number of similar recommendations before this committee last summer.
So the backdrop to this, as I understand it, is that when I used to get wiretap warrants, we would get to listen in to the American on the other end of the phone call of the individual as to whom we had a legal wiretap. And there were a lot of restrictions on what you could do with those conversations. There were restrictions called minimization as to help minimize the intrusion on the privacy. But the notion that a so-called innocent person is going to have their conversations overheard when the government is lawfully collecting information is not a novelty. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator.
And could you give us an idea, other than the unfortunately named PCLOB, what other safeguards are arrayed around the 702 program? What other watchmen are there to assure that Americans' privacy is not abused, specifically including inspectors general and the minimization enforcement apparatus?
Thank you, Senator. So you've alluded to a couple of those already, the inspectors general, and they do play an important...
How many inspectors general have a look into this?
So all of the implementing agencies, the inspectors general would have a role, so that would include NSA, that would include CIA, FBI, and potentially others as well.
And they have their own inspectors general, so it's not like there's one inspector general, those are separate agencies, correct?
Yes, and I believe there's also an inspector general for the whole intelligence community.
Correct. And then as to minimization enforcement?
Right, so there are minimization procedures for each agency that handles data under Section 702, and those are designed to protect U.S. person information and U.S. person identities. So that would be CIA, FBI, NSA, and NCTC. There are also targeting procedures in place to ensure that it's only non-U.S. persons overseas who are targeted. The Justice Department's national security decision, as I understand it, based on the board's report from 2014, reviews each individual targeting decision after the fact. So that's a fairly rigorous internal check. There are also spot checks by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The General Counsel's office are involved. The NSA has its own Office of Compliance. There are privacy and civil liberties officers in each of the relevant agencies. And then, of course, there's the FISA court, which reviews the program each year, but has taken a forward-leaning role in enforcing consequences for compliance incidents at the agencies. And then, of course, Congress's oversight committees, this committee, the House Judiciary Committee, the two intelligence committees. And so those are checks in all three branches of government, a rigorous and multi-layered oversight system.
Good, thank you. Let me switch to Mr. Domenico. Mr. Domenico, in 2014, there was litigation in the Colorado District Court in front of Judge Jackson, who I'm sure you're familiar with, between Arch Cole and the Bureau of Land Management over a lease. Okay. And the issue was, ought the court to apply some recognition of the harm from carbon emissions in evaluating that. The court held that it was arbitrary and capricious to fail to, and required them to go back and take a look at the social cost of carbon. I don't know if you noticed that case. My question is, has anybody talked to you about that case in the context of your nomination and the proceedings that have brought you here today?
I believe I know the case you're speaking of, and the answer to your question is no. No one's spoken to me about that.
Great. Thank you. My time is up.